Run by Dawnaura Weebly, Part 1. Shut up, Jay. There's no way you're going to become the new lord. There hasn't been a lord chosen in over a century. I laughed as I sipped on my evening supplement meal. That's exactly why I should be chosen, Z. I mean, if there hasn't been a lord in over 100 years, then we've got to be getting close to a new one being chosen, right? Who better than me? He stood up proudly at the lunch sector table, pointing at his puffed-up chest. I got what it takes, Z. I'm telling ya. I rolled my eyes as I smiled. Sure you do, Jay, I replied. Sit down, J09, a guardian shouted from across the lunch sector. Jay immediately sat down as he watched the guardian tap her electric baton in a show of authority. He continued his excited self-glorification in whispers as she finally looked away and carried on monitoring the rest of the children. When I become lord, the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of their stupid batons, he whispered angrily. Shh, I scolded. If they hear you saying that kind of stuff, you could get put in the re-education center for threatening speech, Jay. You know that's a very serious offense. Jay sat back down, frustrated. He knew I was right. Jay and I had been best friends since before I can remember. We were both introduced to the world on the same day and grew up here in the children's wing of Bunker 77 together. He was an odd one, and one of the few children who actually made it back from the re-education center. Most never came back. Word was, if re-education was unsuccessful, they transferred those children to another center for the dysfunctional. It was to keep them from negatively influencing the other children and spoiling the good fruit. I still remember the day he was hauled away. When he finally returned after a few months, he refused to speak to anyone for days. I tried to ask him why he was taken and what it was like, but he refused to tell me anything. You don't ever want to go there, Z, is all he would say, before abruptly changing the subject. I could have pressed him, but I doubt it would have been any good to any avail. He was stubborn beyond words at times. I can hardly believe it, Z. Gleaning day's tomorrow. We can finally get out of the children's wing and join the main. Do you think it's as nice as they say it is? Jay said, his demeanor much more excited again. Are you kidding? I imagine it's even better in person. I can hardly wait to see what my selected service will be. Maybe I'll be a guardian. I smiled at the idea of having such an important job. A guardian? You? Seriously, Z, you're too nice to be a guardian. Besides, if you were a guardian, you'd be stuck in the children's wing for your selected service when the new children were introduced after Gleaning Day. You'd be stuck here for another 17 years. Aren't you ready to get out of this place? Jay said back. I guess you're right. Maybe you will be the new lord? Jay said after a long pause. I laughed at the idea. Me? Now that's even funnier than you being the next lord. I snorted back my laughter, trying to keep from spewing my meal. Unexpectedly, Jay reached across the table and placed his hand gently over mine. It shocked me, and I quickly pulled my hand away. I looked around to make sure no one was watching. Touching of any kind was not permitted between the children of opposite sexes. Oddly enough, although I was afraid of being caught, I felt my face flush. But in a good way? Don't do that, Jay. You'll get us in trouble. He sighed and pulled his hand back toward himself. He looked down at the table and then looked back up at me with a cold, hard seriousness. I'm serious, Jay. If anyone should be the Lord, besides me, of course, he smirked as he managed to insert his smart aleck sarcasm, before but quickly returning to his serious expression. It's you. I've never met anyone more fair and kind. I felt my face go flush again. I wasn't sure what to say back to him as my heart fluttered. I'd never felt like this before. I felt both scared and an overwhelming joy. What was this feeling? I quickly changed the tune of the conversation. Listen, Jay, it's time we think realistically. We're about to enter the main as adults. I doubt anyone will be chosen as the new lord on Gleaning Day. I honestly could care less what selected service I receive as long as I can finally live among the adult population in the main. Why do you always do that? Jay said, frustrated. Do what? I snapped back, knowing full and well what he meant. Every time I mean, you don't let you... Dear children of Bunker 77, evening supplement is over, and it's time to return to your designated pod stations. The intercom interrupted Jay before he could finish. Look at that! Evening supplement's over, I said in haste, trying to rush away from the table to avoid him pressing me on whatever just happened. Z! Jay shouted for my attention as I walked away briskly. I pretended not to hear him and headed straight to my designated pod as quickly as possible, and prepared for lights out. The next day. Z24, you're next, the Guardian shouted as she stepped outside the door into the hall where I stood. I was waiting impatiently with all the others on the bright strip of yellow tape on the cold glazed cement floors in the hall. Our heads and body hair had just been freshly shaven moments before, and the draft in the hall, whooshing upon my now bare scalp, sent a sudden shiver down my body. Jay had been called back about 40 minutes or so before me. He tried to get my attention from ahead of the filed row, but he was so far ahead, I could pretend not to hear him. I stepped out of file and walked straight towards the Guardian, who was dressed in the usual black uniform, her electric baton poking from her belt. Z24, the Guardian asked sharply. Yes, Guardian, I responded immediately. I could tell by her tone that she was feeling rather impatient, and I wasn't going to risk testing her patience in the slightest. I, as well as all the others, know a thing or two about those batons, and I was in no mood to be introduced on the matter. Then again, who was anyone in a mood? The Guardian looked over me. She inspected me from the top of my head down to my too small jumpsuit and my bare feet. I see you've grown much this year by the looks of your suit, she said in a monotone and annoyed voice. Yes, Guardian. Well then, it's a good thing it's gleaning day for you then. Yes, Guardian. I smiled slightly, trying to remain serious for such an event, but it was difficult not to express my excitement. The Guardian must have caught my smile and looked at me disapprovingly. I quickly snapped back to perfect attention. Well, let's just hope you make it to see your pretty new suit, she chimed with snide. Make it? What does she mean by that? I thought to myself, quite perplexed by her odd choice of verbiage. Before I had a chance to ponder on the matter further, she juts out her arm, pointing toward the open door just next to her. Room 4, she snapped coldly. I quickly entered through the door, and it slammed shut immediately behind me. Boom! The sound echoed through the empty hall. I felt lonely in the empty hall. Once the echoes faded, I heard the faint sounds of medical machinery coming from each of the large, tall, metal doors on either side of the blank canvas of a hall. Each door was painted crisply with a large number, and each had a small octagonally shaped window toward the top and center. I walked slowly. Each pitter-patter of my bare feet still managed a reverberating sound down the long hall. Curious and slightly frightened at the emptiness, I wondered what was happening behind each door. Alas, the windows were too high up on the door for me to get a good look inside. All I managed to see was the bright LED light shining from either side. Even though the halls seemed to go on into endless oblivion, I only had to walk past 3 of them until I reached my designated room, door 4. I walked inside and found nothing but an empty white room. Confused, I nearly walked out when I heard a female voice over an intercom of sorts. Z24? I looked around aimlessly in the room and answered, Yes, I'm Z24, trying to hide my fear and remain in a professional composure. Confirmed. Close the door behind you and step in the center of the room, the voice on the speaker said matter-of-factly. As instructed, I shut the door behind me, and it slammed with a loud metal thud, which I am sure resounded through that dreaded hall, causing me to slightly jump in surprise. I stepped into the center of the room, unsure of where I should set my gaze. The room was so bright white, it made me squint uncomfortably. Remain calm and perfectly still, the female voice said. Suddenly I heard the whooshing sound of air blowing into the room. From where? I couldn't see since I was too afraid to move, even my eyes, to find the source. To my sheer amazement and terror, I felt myself become lighter and drift towards the center of the perfectly square and white room. I found it hard to keep my balance like this and slightly slipped forward midair. "Don't move," the female voice shouted angrily. I stiffened my muscles and I even held my breath to avoid another mishap. I wanted to scream, but I knew doing so would require me to actually breathe. The lights in the room began to flicker, and I could see small openings in the walls begin to open as long, flexible tubes started to emerge from them. They were getting closer to me. I wanted to get away. I no longer cared if I upset anyone. I was starting to run, but it was no use. I was trapped in the air. "Stop moving. Stop it, Z-24. I command you to stop." "No! Let me out of here!" I screamed. I managed to whirl around and see through the small window in the door I had walked in through. I could now see what was going on in the other rooms from across the hall. I froze. Jay? He was in the room directly across the hall from me, floating mid-air, suspended tubing attached to his lifeless and dull-looking body. "You're killing him! What are you doing to us?" I screamed as I struggled helplessly in the air. "Jay! Jay!" I hoped he could hear me. If I could just get to the door, I could get to him. "Jay! Wake up, Jay!" As I fought helplessly, I could hear the sound of air rushing into the room again. I quickly felt myself getting tired. I tried to fight it, but it was no use. "They're killing us," I thought to myself. I'm dying. They're killing me." I felt myself go limp. My eyelids were the last to stand and fight, but even they succumbed to whatever was weakening me, and everything just simply faded away to nothing.